Well, yesterday I tried to talk about religions of ascending and religions of descending, trying to make the point that I felt that Jesus put the two together rather well. We haven't done as well. And today I want to try to make that connection historically for you to see how we got into this position. There's no point, as we always say, in blaming anybody or looking for the person we can now condemn. We're all victims of history and we're all beneficiaries of history. But before I dive into making this connection, why people at the top, emperors, kings, queens, they much prefer ascending religion. And you can probably already begin to make that connection, why they would. But before I do that, I need to make what I think is an important disclaimer. Because over the years, we've seen the gospel misused by people at the top who are quite happy when we talk about the language of descent. Because they say, yeah, those slaves should be into carrying the cross. You know? Those refugees, they should learn how to suffer a little better. Huh? This has been a common misuse of the gospel, and it has to be stated very clearly. You can't glibly use language of powerlessness as if it's always good, or power that it's always good, and we have to make, as maybe we Catholics love to do too much, important distinctions between good power and bad power, between good powerlessness and bad powerlessness. We have Jesus on the cross illustrating the great self-emptying of God mirrored in the water wheel of the Trinity, where they're all self-emptying, waiting for infilling. That's good powerlessness. Even that's hard for us to really accept. But what we've too often been satisfied with is bad powerlessness. Let's call it oppression. Let's call it, well, yeah, your group, you take that side and we'll take the other side. And the dominant group always decides that power is for them and powerlessness is for the other. So voluntary poverty, chosen simplicity are high-level Christian virtues. But enforced poverty, I don't think so. So this might seem like just an academic distinction, but I want to make it right at the beginning. So anything we're saying here about the path of descent cannot be confused and easily projected on, yes, those poor people on the other side of the border. They should learn how to descend a little more. Huh? That's always the way it's operated. Those at the top choose the way of further ascent, and anybody at the margins is supposed to, as we said, carry the cross. So, that's just my first disclaimer. Okay, I'm going to rely on notes more than usual because I can't miss any historical stage of this to see how we got into the place we're in today. Let me say another overall thing. I'm sure you've all heard the definition of a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is one can only win by causing another to lose. Now, unless that's stated real clearly for us, we don't realize how often that's at work. That it's not really a game where I have some wonderful gift to show, but I just have to defeat the other side. It's called, in normal parlance, the win-lose worldview. And I want to say as strongly as I can, although I think I've tried to do it over the years, is that win-lose worldview, zero-sum game, is so dominant in the dualistic mind of normal people. First of all, it's all a game of winning and losing, which is a poor way of defining reality. But the only way we can really win is to make sure there are losers. Right? A zero-sum game demands losers. There have to be. And it's amazing how we take some kind of happy delight in this. I mean, all you need to do is build one more stadium in any American city, and the millions of dollars will be there, always. Because that framing of reality for another soccer team, football team, baseball team, we like that. We like winners and losers, so much so that at this point in our history, one could say, if Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, the American mind now is, I win, therefore I am. I mean that. That is not an exaggeration. I win, therefore I am. And not revealing the other side of that equation. Whenever you think that, there have to be losers. So you see why that interpretation of the gospel, even though it's no way validated in the four gospels, was quickly taken on by early Christianity. Well, it took a few centuries, but we're going to see how we got there. So, ascending top-down religions love a top-down worldview. Protect the top, make sure the top is winning, and it just so happens that'll make a lot of other people lose. But we don't know, unless we're transformed by grace, we don't know really how to think win-win. And I would say that's a high degree of Christians too. It's not your fault. No one ever told us, because I was presented in the first grade with heaven and hell. It made a nice dualistic explanation to keep little boys from doing bad things. Did it have much to do with Jesus? I don't think so. But when we frame the whole world that way, that's the way we framed reality. So Walter Wink called it a worldview of domination. That we got to make sure someone has the power, someone is in control, and the job of religion is to protect that control. Now, that wasn't the first 2 centuries. The first 2 centuries, I mentioned it yesterday, was the Desert Fathers and Mothers, with these simple little stories about transformation and prayer and purity of heart. They almost seem harmless to us now because they're so innocent. Systematic dogma and doctrine and morality hasn't emerged yet. And I'm not saying that's bad. But the big turning point, and we've said this probably in this room 20 times over the years, was, of course, that notorious year 313. So in the year 313, after being kicked around for several centuries, Christians naturally get tired of being kicked around. And we're quite happy and excited and even liberated when a Roman emperor, God bless him, Constantine, makes us the established religion of the whole Roman Empire. Overnight, after 313, we moved from the bottom to the top. Now, we Roman Catholics were never really told that, but that's one of the reasons we're called Roman Catholics. We were that first great appearance, of this new alignment. And we can prove scripturally that after 313, certainly in the 400s, 500s, the next centuries, you want to know what is the least quoted part of the New Testament? The Sermon on the Mount. You can't talk about loving enemies. You can't talk about not taking oaths. That's loyalty systems that hierarchies depend upon. You can't talk about turning the other cheek. It just doesn't make sense anymore. Because the lens through which we read the teaching of Jesus was not bottom up, but top down. How can we protect the top? And for the next 7 councils of the church, you can check me out on this if you think I'm making up this history. They're all convened by emperors and overseen by emperors. What if we had our church councils in the White House? What would you think of that? How much freedom, how much truth could you handle, all right? Your frame is pretty small, what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say anymore. This wasn't done maliciously. It wasn't done even with understanding. I'm sure if I had been thrown before the lions in the Colosseum for 2 centuries, I would be so happy with any emperor who's going to defend me. I can't blame him. I would have done the same thing. But you've got to know that's when we began to turn. Now that's the birth of what we Catholics then call and still call religious life. After 313, masses of more sincere, I don't know what else to call them, they said, we're not going to take this watered-down version we're hearing in the churches of Rome and Milan every Sunday. We want to take this transformative journey seriously. And they went off primarily to Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and eastern Turkey, which is called Cappadocia. That was the birth of what eventually was called monasticism. There's no evidence of monasticism in Jesus. We have a hard time justifying this whole thing. If you want to find, well, we found quotes that fit. But that's some of the reason we got into this trouble. We don't see Jesus pushing celibacy, our men living separate, our women living separate. He's preaching good news for all the people. Huh? But once that becomes so watered down, and it's just saluting the emperor instead of the Lord Jesus, whole groups become a different level of Christianity. I don't know what else to call it. And that lasted not just until the Reformation, but until our time. And I'm a product of it. I'm not saying it's completely bad. Look, it produced me. Isn't this one? Forgive me. Because sometimes it's good to be off to the side of the whole game. And that's where we serve very often in a prophetic role, that we didn't buy the mainline orthodoxy because we knew it had been watered down. So, I mentioned, being poor in spirit, his opening line in the Sermon on the Mount. We can't talk about that anymore. Emperors don't want people poor in spirit. They want loyalists. They want people who salute the flag. They want national security states. Any talk of nonviolence, frankly, goes underground until the 20th century. That's how well it was buried. And I mean, just read the Sermon on the Mount. Now, you Mennonites and you Amish, if there are any of you out there, you Quakers, you always knew this. But those of us from the main line, we didn't know that. We weren't told that. And in fact, we were told, well, watch out for those strange Anabaptist types who don't accept the mainline orthodoxy. Trust in divine providence instead of a national security state. Non-judgmentalism in general. Empires need clear judgments about up and down, who's in and who's out, who's right and who's wrong, who's our enemy and who's our friend. Now, the second significant date, this is admittedly a quick dance through history, is 1054. In 1054, God bless him, the Bishop of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople, representing the two great traditions at that time. We would speak of them as the Greek Church and the Latin Church. On a very nice day, they mutually excommunicated one another. Isn't that nice? This is the triumph of dualistic thinking, all right? So we haven't had what I'm going to call the undivided church. We Catholics used to call it one holy Catholic and apostolic, but we weren't told it hasn't been Catholic for a long time. It was Roman Catholic, but we didn't pay much attention to the Greek Church, the Eastern Fathers. And you've heard me say this in this very room, forgive me, but do you know where most of the contemplative teaching was? In the East. That's why most of you weren't taught this. Do you know where most of the teaching on God is saving history, the cosmic Christ, which is going to be my next book? It was all in the Eastern Church. We like this win-lose scenario. We like the zero-sum game where it's very clear who was in and who was out. So we had the Holy Roman Empire in the West, the Byzantine Empire in the East, and basically we stopped talking to one another. Now when God bless you, you good Protestants came along and tried to reform the mess we Catholics had made of things by the 16th century. The only thing no one told you is you were only reforming half of the church. So you thought your reforms were so magnificent, and they were. I hope that wasn't said in a patronizing way. It sounded like it. But my real point is, you didn't know anything about the contemplative, mystical, cosmic message in the Eastern Church. It wasn't even in the equation. In our arguments for the last 500 years, it hasn't even been a question. You bought the win-lose, zero-sum interpretation of the Western Church. And in fact, you enforce hellfire even worse than we did sometimes. It became the enforcement tool, of course. So, the Holy Roman Empire morphs into the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire. I was just teaching in Europe last month. Just go to Vienna if you want to see an imperial city. You say, how could cities build this many magnificent buildings? Well, whenever there's an imperial city, do know there's a lot of outskirt cities who are paying for all of that at the center. It's no accident that empires seem to coalesce power and money and war around themselves. And in the other main Western form was the Spanish Empire, which brought its version of Western Roman Catholicism to the New World and to this very state. So it handed on a reading of the gospel that did not threaten top-down power, did not threaten war-making and the accumulation of wealth, but was presumably perfectly aligned with it. And that's why people still think I'm a heretic when I critique capitalism. You do know, maybe you don't know, until the 1100s, it was considered material for excommunication to take interest on a loan. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. But I would love to know how many of you have ever enjoyed interest on money you have lent. It's the name of the game. That was called usury, and you were kicked out of the church for taking advantage of someone else's disadvantage. That lasted till the 11th century. But we are so aligned with the money-making system we have now that, let's be honest, much of the teaching of Jesus, where he says the top will be bottom and bottom will be top, doesn't make a bit of sense to us, and we don't even agree with it. Now, I mentioned yesterday to make the Irish and the Scots happy. There's the other outliers, and those are those who remained outside of empire. You're always going to see that's the key to the pure interpretation. In the Protestant world, this non-imperial Christianity was probably best illustrated, I mentioned it, by the Anabaptist movement, which led to groups, most of them, we Catholics didn't even take them seriously, forgive us. Mennonites, the Amish, the Brethren of the Common Life, the Hutterites, the Waldensians, the German Baptists, not the other Baptists, the Bruderhof, and even the Quakers, although the Quakers aren't really Anabaptists. But these all emphasize things like simple lifestyle, non-participation in war, not taking oaths to governments, not saluting flags and systems of this world. We grew up, well, we didn't in my particular church, but with the American flag and the papal flag right there in the same sanctuary, as if they were equal. Well, the papal flag was just as much a problem, actually. But, of course, why do we need these loyalty oaths to begin with? Well, you and I were raised to take them for granted. So I know I'm sounding like a terribly dangerous person. But I'm just trying to honor the perennial tradition, that it wasn't always this way. And what you take for granted as normative Christianity is, in fact, not the continuous alternative orthodoxy that was never highly touted or praised. Why? Because it critiqued the system. And remember, as I said yesterday, anything you cannot critique will soon become idolatrous. Let me repeat it. Anything you cannot critique will soon be a false idol. It's almost certain. I used the stronger word yesterday, it will become demonic. It's anything considered too big to fail. The military-industrial complex, the banking system, the penal system, or even the healthcare system, Pick on all of them, When it's so big, so gigantic, that we can't imagine a world without it. And we all have to be on bended knee before it. That's precisely the world that Jesus meant to undercut from the beginning. And we were allowed to give our loyalties to all of these systems. And now I think that's why we find ourselves with such an ineffective Christianity. Because we're basically trying to play both games. Trying to say we honor the absolute that is God, when the real absolutes we honor are country and money and capitalism and war and power and all the rest. That is a conflict, I'd be willing to say, in the heart of every person in this room, me too. It cannot not be, because no one taught us how to put the two together. I should mention these groups that emphasize things like simple lifestyle. I know we're lucky enough to have a number of Mennonites here. These groups were never established by any state whatsoever, nor did they enjoy the privileges that came from being the established religion of England or the established religion of the Roman Empire or the Spanish Empire. Once you're established, be careful. Your ability to speak truth will be highly limited, all right? And you know that's true. There's a whole bunch of things you cannot say anymore. You're simply not allowed to say them because you are pledging allegiance to at least two different flags. So, the other strong example of non-imperial Christianity, and Barbara illustrated it, I think, so magnificently this morning, is an example that's almost unlike any other. That we have a group of enslaved people. I want to point out, before I dive into it, do know that's exactly how the whole Judeo-Christian tradition starts. A group of enslaved people who are liberated by God. So their starting point is not to prove how holy they are and how saved they are and how superior they are, but in fact, it's an experience of extreme unliberation, oppression, woundedness, rejection, and shame. And I don't know any other example where you have a people like the enslaved peoples of the Americas who accepted slaveholder religion, and let's call it that, who accepted the religion of their masters. What humility! What unbelievable humility. These people who beat them. Why would you think their God had anything good to say to anybody? And as an aside, once you have slaveholder religion, I think we have moved so far from anything approaching anything Jesus said, that you may not call it Christianity anymore. It's a search for order, it's a search for control, it's a search for superiority. And let's bring it closer to home. It was localized in the southern states of the United States of America. And this is the version that was spread to the world under the name of born-again evangelicalism, which was always understood rather immediately by people at the top, by people who had something to protect. But the amazing thing, and the real point I want to make, is why did the slave people themselves accept it? But here's the difference. They turned it on its head because they came in with a different starting point. We came in at the top, using it for social order and control and war and all the rest, and so-called honor, just another word for ego very often. They came in exactly where the people in the New Testament come in, because they need healing. We cannot emphasize enough how the importance of Jesus constantly healing people. And we always interpreted, most of the sermons I heard, the first part of my life, all the healing stories were simply to prove that Jesus was God. There you go. Only God could do that. And yet when you read, after a good third of those stories, after Jesus heals somebody, he says, don't talk about it. Didn't you as preachers struggle with that? Why is he always saying, don't talk about it? Don't tell anybody that because he knew we were going to do that, I think. Make it into a bunch of miracle stories. No, it's that the people seeking healing, people needing healing, the people who are oppressed at the edge and at the bottom, they can hear the gospel through the right lens. They need it so bad. They want truth, they want love, they want dignity, they want good power so bad. They've seen bad power misused by people of religion so often that they have a clarifying lens right at the beginning. And I think that's what we see in these black spirituals. I was lucky. I had 2 jobs my year as a deacon in 1969. First, I was sent out here to Acoma Pueblo, and my first preaching of the gospel was to native peoples. And I realized they had a very different lens than the white audience I was raised in. Then I went back to Dayton, Ohio, and the next 6 months I was at a Black Parish Resurrection Church on the north end of Dayton. And the second half of my year as a deacon, I got to preach to, again, not nice white folks, but black folks who heard this same, and they were Catholics, believe it or not, and they heard the gospel on a whole different level and allowed me to hear the gospel on a whole different level. And then, in 1986, I moved here to New Mexico to establish the center, and immediately 2 wonderful nuns came to me who were trying to hold together the ministry at the city jail just a few blocks from here. And they said, Richard, we can't get any priests to visit the prisoners. Would you at least take on a part-time role of being jail chaplain? So, there it was again. I got to preach the gospel in a different arena 3 times. The native peoples, the black peoples, and here in New Mexico, the imprisoned peoples. And then I noticed, you know what I'm going to say, there was an undue amount of people of color in the prison. Are they really always the bad people? Huh? Why were there so many native people in the prison? Why are there so many black people in this state that doesn't have a lot of black people? And so many Latinos. It all just fits together after a while. And this is the worldview. Most of us, it's not your fault. It's not anybody's fault. I'm not trying to shame anybody or make you feel guilty, but we got to know there's a whole tradition we never heard about. We were given a model of religion that's worldview was order and the maintaining of order. And ironically, it was the order that was taught, first of all, in Sunday school class or catechism in my church, where you naturally understood it as a 7-year-old would. And there's some innocence and beauty and receptivity at that level, but there's also some dangerous naivete. If you have any little kids between 7 and 12, they love black and white worldviews of good guys and bad guys. Right? So frame it that way, it makes sense to the dualistic mind of a child. They're sort of mystical up to 7. Did you know that? But they start losing it around 7. It was so ironic how we made 7, we called it the age of reason. Now you can go to communion. You can understand. It's so sad, I've got to laugh, because we were actually less capable of communion at 7 than we were up to 7, you see. We don't have any trouble with angels and mystery and spirit and deeper meanings to things, mythic understandings, archetypal understandings. They just get it automatically when you tell them stories. Around 7, we start getting rational. That's what we call it, the age of reason. Now they can go to communion. And so we understood this mystery of the Eucharist in a reasonable way. That's the only mind we've had for 500 years. We lost the older way of thinking. We lost the alternative consciousness, which was non-dual, mystical, contemplative, intuitive, archetypal, symbolic. Use whatever word you want, but it's a much broader way of reading reality, or artistic, or musical, or dancing. And we localize truth not just in the top 3 inches of our body, but in the left side of the top 3 inches of our body. All right? I want you to see, that's really a very small part of me. All right? No wonder we're in the hole that we're in. So Jesus' worldview is not about maintaining order. You show me a passage where he's about maintaining order and saluting the higher-ups. His worldview is much more clever. We would say non-dual. How do you integrate disorder within order? If that's not the good news, there's no good news, because everything's disorder. If we're honest about it, you are, I am. That's how our dang bishops got into this scandal we're in now. They had no ability to deal with sin, disorder, woundedness. This is not their conversation. It's over here maintaining a world of idealized order that in fact does not even exist, if anybody's honest. What the world of idealized order cannot deal with is what we call the shadow. And you've had 2 marvelous Barbaras talking to you about it. The twilight zone. The world which is a mixture of darkness and light. But tell me, were any of us raised how to do the work of discernment and listening? Now the words for that, the code words for that, integrating disorder inside of order and not throwing out either one of them, here are the code words: forgiveness. You see, when you forgive, when God forgives you, God isn't saying you didn't do something stupid. You did something real stupid. But you know what? I would rather have relationship with you than be right. That's what God is saying. Every time God forgives. And that's God's job description. Preferring relationship to being right. Every time you forgive your wife, you're doing the same thing. You know what, honey? I'd rather have you than be right. I hope you're saying that. There's a few more code words. Mercy. Mercy doesn't, I was presented, honestly, with mercy as like a concession. Okay, I guess we got to show you a little damn mercy. No, mercy is the name of God. It's the nature of God. It's the outflowing of God. It's the Trinitarian water wheel that never stops flowing except in one infinite direction of outpouring. God is mercy. It's not, okay, I'll pull it out of my pocket to offer to you now since you're lesbian. That's the stingy God we're stuck with, who as a final resort, as a last resort, as a concession to unworthy people, no, I'm saved by mercy. Pope Francis is saved by mercy. Queen Elizabeth is saved by mercy, all right? And everybody in between. There's no exceptions. We are all saved in spite of ourselves. Can you begin to hear the beginnings of win-win? Where God is winning and we're winning too? Could that possibly be the gospel? What else is good news? Nothing else is good news. It's not your job to be deciding who's up and who's down, who's in and who's out, who's right and who's wrong. Compassion. Compassion is not a concession that, okay, he deserves it now. Because once you get into this deserving thing, you know what comes with it? Undeserving. And then it's up to you to decide. Well, is she worthy of compassion? None of us are worthy of it. Now, our marvelous word, almost created by Paul, illustrated by Jesus, created by Paul, is the word grace. And I know we have a number of wonderful Lutherans in here who just love the word grace. God, they do, and they should. And we weren't illustrating it very well. But I remember, forgive me, the first time I spoke in a Lutheran Academy of Theology in Hamburg, Germany, with my translator, Andreas. And I was talking, and I thought I was really saying it rather well. But I saw all these mean faces looking at me. It was just terrible. It was, they just did everything they could to attack sort of what I just said to you just now. I said, but I thought you Lutherans, you're the big ones into grace, aren't you? Well, as long as they're, Lutherans. As long as they understand grace our way, and they've been trained with good German theology, and it's just, I can still, Andreas and I left, not in disgrace, but there was not much more applause than that. We went outside, and I'm walking down, I said, what happened in there? What just went on? And I realized I'm talking to myself. My translator isn't there. I look back about half a block, and Andreas is leaning. Now, he's a Lutheran ordained minister, all right? He's leaning against the wall, crying. He's literally crying, sobbing. He says, this is what educated me. And we thought we were reforming you Catholics, and we did, and I agreed that they did. He said, but we ended up reproducing the same thing on another level. Because you see, that's the nature of the ego. There's no denomination fully free from this. You've all got to grow up. You all face the same demons. And the ego at the early levels is going to try to take control. I don't care if you're Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox. You all got to grow up, and you all got to walk through the dark nights that we're talking about. And if you don't have teachers leading you through the dark nights, you will stay in stage 1 or stage 2 with all the good Lutheran theology in the world. And it is good theology. But theology doesn't do it. That's our big principle. That it's relapse, failure, sin, mistake that teaches us the gospel, not dogma and doctrine. So, any integrating of disorder into order and saying that's divine order, holding the two together through the mystery of forgiveness and mercy and compassion. This worldview is inherently subversive to any worldview that wants to maintain order. I don't know how to integrate the people at the edge, the people at the bottom. All it can become is what I'm sad to say we have become. And you know, much of the world thinks of us this way, as an exclusionary religion. We've got to exclude everything that is supposedly disordered and ensconce ourselves against all evidence as the new normal, as the righteous ones, as the pure ones, as the saved ones. We've been playing this game for several hundred years, and it's falling apart because it's not true. And you know I say that having given my life to the following of Jesus. I'm not throwing out Jesus or the gospel or the Sermon on the Mount. What we saw in the Anabaptist tradition and Quakers and many of these who weren't controlled by empire is we saw that in fact the Sermon on the Mount, the part of Jesus' direct teaching that we quoted the least, almost became their creed. They didn't recite the Nicene Creed like we do every Sunday, not even knowing what it means for the most part. It's just our loyalty test. I'm not against the Nicene Creed. I could defend every line of it. Hear me in a both-and way. But just because you agree with that, just because you've saluted the right flag, doesn't mean your heart is pure or open or free or even in love with anybody. If it isn't finally, and this sounds like a cliche, I'm sure, but if it isn't finally creating loving people, what good is it? I don't think Jesus needs it. I don't think the world needs it. And I don't think the world cares about it anymore. When we're known as people who are judgmental instead of forgiving. So empires depend on meritocracy in some form. You have to have class systems. You have to have caste systems. It's the only way it works. And somehow the job of those at the top of the class system is to define normalcy, define order, and of course they always place themselves right at the top. The reign of God that Jesus came to give us depends on a few quotes. I could go for half an hour with these quotes. Giving the one who comes at the last hour as much as the one who worked all day. Deal with that. Capitalists, deal with that. Or Matthew 23, inviting to the great banquet, go out to the highways and the byways, invite everybody, good and bad alike. Damn it! No, not bad. Now you go back and read the Gospels. It's all there, but you can't see what you weren't given permission to see. You can't see what you weren't told to look for. In fact, Jesus' constant metaphor for eternal life, and you check me out on this, it's not a courtroom. The closest it comes to that is Matthew 25, and there he's saying you're going to be judged, if there is a courtroom, on how you treated the least of the brothers and sisters. The least of the brothers and sisters. It wasn't whether you recited the Nicene Creed on Sunday, all right? But all his other metaphors for eternal life are a wedding banquet or a great banquet. Count them up. Go through all the gospel again and again, where he presents himself as the bridegroom and humanity as the bride. And his very first sign in John's gospel is at the end of one of these wedding feasts, creating 150 gallons of intoxicating wine. Right? Because that's this good message. It's an intoxicant. It's too good to be true. It leads you to a drunken love of God, to recognize that God could be that generous, that outpouring, that infinite in love. But when you start with ascending, you tend to never change that posture. It's always about, being more perfect, being higher up, being holier than thou. When you start with your wounds, this is the power, to be very close to home and frank, of the 12-step movement. And why many of us are more excited about the basements of churches on Wednesday night than the sanctuaries of churches on Sunday morning. Because the entrance place is just like the black people. Entered the gospel through slavery. Or the Jewish people entered the gospel through, they didn't call it the gospel, the message, through slavery, through needing healing, needing salvation, needing liberation, knowing I am the least of the brothers and sisters. How you start is how you tend to keep interpreting the message. And so all of us got to make mighty sure that we know we're coming here not because we're better, but because we're wounded. If I was allowed to name the Christian religion, I would call it the religion of the wound. And that's why we accepted as our logo the scandalous image of a wounded man who carries those wounds even after the resurrection and shows them off, as it were. This is the way you come to God. You do not come to God through doing it right. You come to God, ironically, through being wounded. Like Jonah, thrown by his own compatriots into the water. And that's the way it usually happens. It isn't always the bad people who damn us to hell. Very often, it's our own friends, our own family, our own neighborhood, the people just like us. Because why? We're not good enough. Many of you have been influenced, I'm sure, by the marvelous work on vulnerability and shame by Brene Brown. And I think for many people, they've come through her work to understand the power and the essence of vulnerability. Vulnera in Latin means wound. A vulnerable person is a wounded person, but who's learned something from their wounds. And they've learned not to project their woundedness on another race, another gender, another group, another class, but they've learned, like Jesus, how to hold it. Once you start loving and including the sinners or losers in any form, you have a worldview that is abhorrent to the class systems, the meritocracies that all empires are built on. And all empires and all imperial thinking is a meritocracy, a falsely created one. We have been given not a win-lose worldview that demands there be losers so we can win, but a win-win worldview. Empires are going to continue, I'm sure, till the end of time to keep dividing the world into winners and losers. You have been liberated from that, right? Don't waste another second of your life deciding who's up and who's down, who's right and who's wrong, who's winner and who's loser. What Jesus did and turned the history of religion on his head, he made, yes, this is not an overstatement, he made the losers into the winners. That's the meaning of the cross. The ultimate loser, shamed by church and state, rejected by high priest and emperor. Wrong, 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 wrong. And this is the one that the Father raises up and says is the icon of transformation for all of history. So any of you who call Jesus your Savior, you better know what kind of Savior you're following, right? And you better know that he still, it seems, at least in the eyes and hearts of the mystics, carries his wounds, like Julian of Norwich says, as his glory, as his honor. Nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to hide from, but in fact the way through. We do not come to God by denying our shadow, by projecting our shadow onto other races, religions, classes, or genders, all right? We come by owning it as our own greatest honor and our own greatest glory. This is, for me, the only thing worthy of being called the gospel. And it still has the power to save the world. In fact, as I think about it with any kind of rational mind, what else could? What else could? Every other system demands losers, demands people we're allowed to hate, we're allowed to reject, we're allowed to expose, we're allowed to blame, on and on. It's almost the only name of our politics, because that's the best they can do. It really is. It's the best they can do. Who is there to blame? So now we've divided ultimate truth between two little parties in the United States called Democrat and Republican. My God. We can do so much better than that, and we are supposed to be the so much better than that. But when we get pulled into these petty dualistic fights, instead of bringing the great contemplative mind that sees through them, beyond them, bigger than them, I don't think we can call ourselves the hope of the world. But you are. I believe you are, because I know some of you are hearing me. And some of you are prepared by life to understand it. You are the hope of the world. Thank you.